Welcome back to Are We Fucked, the podcast that asks the tough questions about the planet while keeping it just irreverent enough to stay sane. I'm Lisa Camillo, your host, anthropologist, and filmmaker with a slight tendency to go down eco rabbit holes. And today, I've got a guest who is here to pull us all into the trenches of environmental activism. Meet Deanna Meyer. She's an environmental warrior on the board of Deep Green Resistance. Remember Derek Johnson? Yep, that crew. And the founder and president of Prairie Protection Colorado. Deanna doesn't just talk the talk. She lives right in the heart of the Pike National Forest, fighting the good fight with the Eco Integrity Alliance from a cute wooden cabin. Her current mission? Not as cute. To stop the wholesale destruction of trees and habitats throughout national forests. Spoiler alert, the US government isn't exactly telling the truth about saving those forests. In this episode, we dive into some pretty wild stuff. Ever feel like media's totally blocking out on environmental issues? It's not your paranoia, it's real. Plus, controlled fires to prevent bigger wildfires? Should we go back to indigenous practices? And the unsung eco-heroes of the day, prairie dogs. They're not just super cute. They play a huge role in water retention and supporting entire ecosystems. Basically, they are the beavers of the prairie, and we'll explain why that's a bigger deal than you think. So strap in, this one's a wild ride. Hello, Deanna, how are you?
Great. How are you? Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
All the way from Colorado?
Yeah. So in Colorado, I'm on what we call the Front Range, which is right where the eastern slope meets the mountains. I'm in a very beautiful Pike National Forest.
Beautiful. Okay, the first question is, are we fucked?
And do you mean we as the human species, or do you mean we as life on the planet, or kind of both?
A bit of A and a bit of B, yes.
Yeah, because we are all connected together. That's a really hard question to answer definitively. We're fucked if we continue on the same trajectory. If we don't come together and start fighting for life on this planet, start fighting for free speech. I mean, lots of times when people are able to garner public support for issues that would slow or stop the destruction, we're completely banned now and not allowed to talk about it. And so it's very hard to organize, and it gets harder every day. An example would be, social media for one. I do a lot of work. So I work on protecting keystone species, and namely prairie dogs. So here in Colorado and in the West, we have this amazing creature. It's a prairie dog. So kind of like a gopher. It's a burrowing animal that provides all these essential services for hundreds of different species of animals and hundreds of different species of plants. And we call it keystone because if it was pulled out of the arch, it would all fall down, which happens in prairies. If you lose the foods that prairie dogs serve so many purposes, if you take them away, everybody else suffers. So it's like in Jenga, if you took out the wrong block, it's going to all fall down. That's the type of species the prairie dogs are.
Yeah.
And then when you try to get the port to change things, say on city council or anything that has to do with politics now, let's say state level, it automatically gets what is called shadow banned on media. So if you use the word ballot measure, or if you use the word voting,
No.
or if you use the word take action, nobody sees it.
What?
Nobody sees it anymore in the feed. So we have to come up with different people now, since COVID, aren't organizing nearly as much on the ground. They're using social media, Substacks and everything like that to try to bring people together, which also makes change very much more difficult. Face-to-face interactions, as we know, anybody who's on social media, so many things can be taken out of reality. And then people are substituting in life relationships and communal building for toxic ones, which don't get the job done. So that's one example of it. So when I'm trying to advocate, say, for a prairie dog colony to save it, it's way harder now than it was before COVID, just to get that word out.
That's insane.
Yeah, even though more and more people are online, things are being hidden. So And that's been a problem with a lot of different topics that people try to address that are really
Yeah,
important.
I've seen it recently that Instagram now, any political content is going to be hidden. And you actually have to go in your settings to actually change it and make it visible. It's insane completely. So, do you think this is the American government or the world is going towards that way? They don't want people to get together and protest and disagree with the government.
I mean, you could probably speak for being in America, but also looking at a lot of different alternate viewpoints. So I'm grateful for podcasts and for things that you do because those are also becoming popular. So that's a light as well, because we can go ahead and break off from those globalist controlled things. But I do believe that it's not limited to the United States at all. I mean, we saw a lot of things that happened in terms of globalist agendas during the COVID that came out to light where people weren't really aware that the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum and all these places are putting, measures in to make this a tighter control over who can speak, what we can speak on, and how to hide it, how to not let anybody just to how to pretty much squash all dissent and to keep everybody under really tight surveillance so that anybody who's trying to buck the system, as we say, or trying to fight for what they believe in, what's right, for, in my case, the environment and for non-humans, it's really easy to shut down any type of power that we would gain from that. So you see things like in the environmental movement on a bigger scale where environmentalists used to fight for everything all they were worth to protect particular places or species and land and try to keep those from being destroyed. And now that it's been hijacked and now you see people fighting to destroy deserts to put up solar panels, to destroy our oceans to put in windmills, and all these things are just as they're not slowing down any fossil fuel consumption. They're just adding to it and they're creating a further destruction. So people aren't anymore fighting for those deserts that have have some of the most biodiverse habitats that are left. And they're cheering on solar panels that are absolutely devastating. If we continue to allow these globalist ideas, which really is the same as a cultural idea. I mean, that's another big problem when you say, are we fucked? We can have infinite growth on a finite planet. Now, anybody knows that's not true and that we're destroying our future generations and possibly we might see the loss too of our species, even in my lifetime. And I'm 52 years old. So there's a lot of things going on that continue to accelerate and people continue to disengage from each other and from our environment so that we're more and more plugged into the machines and we're more and more able to distance ourselves from the reality of the situation that we're in. I mean, we could look at artificial intelligence. There's so many different things that are very scary when you start understanding the disconnect with physical reality that we're barreling into. I mean, we really are a train or maybe a plane or even a rocket that keeps gaining speed. And in front of us is a very solid wall that we're about to run into.
It's so funny. All the scientists have this metaphor.
Yeah. So, I mean, are we fucked, as you say? Yes. Yep. Yes. We are wholly fucked if we continue on the same trajectory. If we don't change our ways, if we don't understand that consuming the planet is going to consume us and everybody else is going to be consumed and destroyed with us, then we're fucked.
You mentioned, though, the World Economic Forum, because everybody's been talking about that actually. And I haven't probably just learned enough about what went on and why they have that agenda you're talking about, why they are not allowing free speech and people protesting and wanting the right things for this earth and for humans and human rights and even species rights. Why do you think that's their agenda?
I mean, I think it's the same goal as this culture always has, which is to have complete and total control and to play God over everybody. I think they're aware and they've talked about several times that the population is going to become a big problem and an issue because our resources, we are running out of them. So how can they get everybody corralled up and controlled so that when the crisis situation comes down, that they can have a better handle or grasp or control or whatever. We've seen some things coming out of the World Economic Forum that are very scary, very strategic laws to include like a big array of like equality and these things that they're using and they're twisting on their head, and diversity and these things that in the end allow people to give up because they want to do the right things. So people will give up rights that they have, like free speech. They try to stifle like any type of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, which is basically just saying you're not allowed to talk and say what you want. Sometimes you wonder about if humans are really stupid, but they're not. If people are given the right and encouraged to listen to other people's side, the truth usually comes out on top. It's when you stifle the debates and you just start saying one line that people are easily manipulated into that idea. It's just the idea that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can continue to destroy habitats and we can continue to destroy everything. And if we tighten the control on everybody else, maybe we can, you know, I don't know if it's a fantasy they have that we're going to be able to go to Mars or download our brains into an artificial intelligence and live forever. I don't know. It's all so strange and so disconnected from physical reality. And it's so disconnected from this beautiful planet that is a miracle. This planet is a miracle. And we should be fighting with everything we have to ensure that life remains on this planet, the life we know, the polar bears, all this different species. I mean, we have like 200 species going extinct every day because we're destroying habitat. I mean, we really should be caring about that. We're not better than that. We are that. We are all tied together in a web of life, and every string of that spider web that we break, like the keystone species, eventually it just all collapses.
Absolutely. I agree. I'm scared that we are way past that point. So, do you think population is an issue, or is where the power is the issue?
They go together. I mean, of course, the population is an issue, and the amount that people are consuming in first world nations is another. You could increase the population, like just looking at the numbers, we're actually much greater than the numbers if you look at it in terms of what we're actually taking from our life sustaining planet to, basically run this incredibly entitled existence. If you overexploit your environment, it always ends in collapse. Now we're at a world level. We're not just the Egyptian. We're like the entire globe is now connected in this system of exploitation and globalism. I'm also part of Deep Green Resistance, and then I do a lot of work with trying to protect any species. If a species is gone, they're gone forever. So I try to work really hard to protect any prairie dogs. Also, there's a lot of forest thinning going on in the United States. They're using an excuse to kill all of our forests so that there aren't fires, that the fires won't be so bad. And it's all totally not true. The science shows that thinning does nothing to slow fire severity. When you have a severe fire, it's climate and wind that drives them, not fuel load.
So, what's going on? So, the government, so what is the government doing?
We have an entity called the Forest Service that manages the forests, and it was started in the late 19th century. They started it in the 1900s. They had the first forest rangers, and it was actually originally created, the Forest Service, to try to make forests more sustainable so that we could continue to build and have forests, because they recognize, just like with lots of hunting groups, that
Uh,
if you don't have regulations and if you allow people just to have free reign, we won't have forests anymore. They'll be gone. So it was a sustainable yield like program. So now the Forest Service oversees a lot of our public land forests. And they've always been interested and funded by timber industry. So they allow logs to be taken out, but they try to keep it so that they can have more harvest, right? So that they can reharvest the forest. But now with the fires that are happening, and we've had several, severe fires with the climate when it gets dry and windy, we get fires, and they've shifted kind of the funding base for the whole forest in the West to try to proactively combat wildfires. I could go on and on about this, but there's a lot of research showing actually when you cut trees out of, so they call it thinning. So they go into a forest and they take like between 50 and 70% of all the trees, and they leave they leave 30 to 50% of the trees. And it destroys the soil because they're using heavy equipment and they're compacting the soil. They're destroying the mycelial networks. They're destroying habitat
wow.
fully. I mean, just it looks like a clear cut with a
Mhm.
few trees left where they thin, but they've been able to get billions of dollars. They have this in their budget already to go through the West and thin. So, like in my backyard, they're planning on thinning
Mm.
117,000 acres in the next few years. And they've shown that when you do this, you actually heat the forest up by like
Mm.
20 degrees so that it's hotter. And then you eliminate windbreaks, because in a fire, it does help to have denser forests because it's the wind that drives the fires. So
Yeah.
they've done research on multiple, not Forest Service. Well, even the Forest Service itself has admitted that forest thinning doesn't do anything to
Wow.
slow fires. And when you have a high intense forest fire, it can jump over a mile river, like the Columbia River, it jumped. So forest
Yeah.
fires, ashes and embers from forest fires can fly a mile and a half away and reignite fires there. So if you've got these really windy, dry conditions, there's no stopping fires unless you actually cut down all of the trees and install sprinkler systems that run 24/7. I mean, fires are a natural part of a forest landscape. So anyway, that now they're going through all these forests that have been protected and that haven't been cut. And now they have these excuses to get in there under emergency status. So they don't even have to look. We have the NEPA laws here where you have Environmental Protection Agency where they have to go in and do ESAs, in which they do surveys, and EISs to make sure there aren't, they try to do through hard work of advocates, they have some laws that they have to follow to try to protect sensitive areas. They say they're emergency projects to help protect people's homes. And so the whole thing, that this is a huge deal and people won't talk about it. This is another blackout media thing. We have tried to get this story out because I live in the forest and I'm
Wow.
trying to stop it. We have contacted every single journalist in Colorado and no one will touch it. No one will talk about it. And all the environmental groups, our big
It's
environmental groups, are
bullshit.
on board with
Yeah.
it too. They're saying, oh, this is improves forest health. And the science, on the ground science, is very conclusive that no, in no way does it improve anything. Doesn't improve fires, doesn't improve health, and it hurts the forest immensely. This whole idea that man knows better than the forest or man can control everything and is why we're in the situation we're in now. And it's why we're facing and watching so many different species going extinct. And we're on that road too. Cutting down forests creates a massive carbon sinking loss. Nothing to sink the carbon, it's just getting put into the air. We all know that it's a really bad idea to cut our forests, and thinning is very similar to clear cut in terms of the overall damage that it does to the forest. It's huge, a huge problem.
So let me get this straight. Basically, they want to get wood. So what they say, using the pretense of actually trying to do something good for the planet and for the forest and for the fires, they're doing the opposite. So they're thinning, so cutting down the wood that they're using commercially. And then they're saying this is good for you. But then if anybody that says, well, actually, that's bullshit, they block you out.
Yeah. And it's worse than that because this is how our bureaucracy works. So the Forest Service has been gifted $5 billion to thin forests in the West, and they are getting more all the time. It's being tacked onto different things. So it's not even about extracting the wood. So, for example, my neighbors went into a contract with Forest Service to have their land thinned, and they have hundreds of piles. They've been there for over 2 years now of thousands and thousands of log decks just
Mm.
sitting there now in big piles rotting. So they're not even taking that wood out. It's a huge fire hazard. Anybody can look at these piles. You can see it on a GPS, how many there are. And then they'll take lots of trees for the thinning. And they have these machines and equipment called mulchers. So they take the trees with these big, huge, heavy equipment and they chunk them up into pieces, fit it all back down on the ground, which also becomes very dry and like kindling wood if you're wanting to focus on the fire aspect. And then in some places with bigger trees, with valuable wood, they're definitely letting the timber industry not only get a bunch of money from the government to thin, but also get the money that they can get from selling that wood commercially. So that goes on too. But the point is like in a lot of the cases in Colorado too, because we don't have these big, really valuable trees all over. We do in some places. And when they do, they'll take them out. But the whole point is like, we're going to give you like $30,000 an acre. And this project is 117,000 acres just to go ahead and kill all those trees so that then we can pretend that now we're safer from fire when actually they've just made the whole situation all around from all different perspectives, not just fire wise, but ecologically wise, habitat wise, carbon wise, way worse. So yeah, it's worse than just they're trying to take the timber out. No, they've got a certain goal and a lot of money to do it that's been approved in our Congresses. And because they've been able to propel this lie and figure out how to get a lot of money propelling the lie,
Wow, that's
that thinning
wow.
forests actually stops fires and that it would protect all of these people. More often than not, fires that go through thinned areas burn hotter and faster. They're more dangerous because of no windbreaks, all this kindling on the ground, and there's no windbreak because fires are not fuel driven. They're driven by wind. Fires that we worry about that firefighters can't control, which we can't control much, but are fires that are very fast moving from wind and they're impossible to stop.
That's disgusting.
Like I said, they can jump over rivers.
Wow.
Just like we had a really bad fire in Colorado. It was the worst one in terms of structure loss 2 years ago. It was called the Marshall Fire. It was in Boulder in a grassland. And Scientific American came out with this really long article talking about how our biggest worries with fire in terms of structures aren't in forests. They're on the grassland. So it's just another way to siphon money to industries like the timber industry.
Very stupid. Very, very stupid humans.
It is. And the big environmental groups don't have a problem with this for some reason because, well, there's a lot of becauses, but they're not sticking up for it and they're not talking against it and they're not trying to stop them. I mean, some groups are, but for the most part, people aren't realizing the severity of how awful this is.
I worked with Aboriginal people in Australia, and it was a common knowledge that they have creating controlled fires underneath the forest. What do you think of those? They say it's healthy for the forest to regrow, but also to prevent big fires. What do you think of that now that we have the science behind it?
Don't agree with that either. For that to work, you have to do it diligently and repetitively. It has to be like a constant upkeep on it. But you're also killing a lot of plants and different beings and mycelium and all this stuff in the soil that would otherwise be living. This is my idea. It's like people talk about this and say, which is also not true. They're finding more and more that before we started suppressing fires, at least in the United States, that there was all these low intensity fires that rushed through the forest and cleaned it all out. And this is just, I don't know where they come up with this because they don't have any evidence of this. Many species dependent on fires. Fires are a good thing. When the reason why I don't like the idea of humans meddling with it and doing low intensity fires is because it is such a high maintenance thing. It also destroys a lot of things. I'm always more into the natural things, and they talk about like indigenous people doing this. And what I understand of the record, indigenous people didn't run around all over our forest and say, boy, that looks unhealthy. Let's start a low level fire. There were specific purposes for fire. So maybe around their village, they might do it. Lots of times they were starting fires to round up grasshoppers because they would eat the grasshoppers. There was a lot of grasshoppers back then. They also would burn where they know that the raspberry bushes or berry bushes grow really well after fires. So for their food supplies, they would, but I don't think they would ever be like, oh, that forest looked a little too thick. Let's burn it. I would have a really hard time believing that. And I don't think that people have time to do that. The only reason we do so much of it is because we have fossil fuel and equipment. But again, too, I think when fires were started, to compare like what people did back before colonization to today is really unfair comparison. And we're not going to get there because people don't live exclusively, at least not in my area, off the land anymore. And they don't have their language, which was completely connected to the environment. And I do believe they had a very strong relationship with the land. And I totally believe, and they all said it too, that they could talk to plants, that they would have visions with living beings, that they had all these stories that connected them very intimately, and they knew the land well. They paid attention. Their language allowed them to have this connection with non-humans, and they were very dependent on that connection and knowledge. So if they were starting fires, I have no doubt that it was in balance with the land because they were living differently and they have these connections, but we don't have those. Even though I want to so badly and I try to connect really bad, our language stops us from that. Our use of consumer goods stops us from having an open connection and a different kind of perception of the land. So we don't have the capability until we get back to living locally and eating locally and depending on our local land base. We don't know what's right. We're making uneducated guesses and we're not locking out the knowledgeable one, the older plants, the animals, those relationships. We don't have like 20, 10, 7 generations of ancestors who've lived in place and have their ancestors buried here. And we don't know where each individual tree is. things are so different now. So it's really hard for me to say, like, yes, let's try these things when we're not trying as hard as we can to lock ourselves back into local land bases. I don't think we know what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, what are your tips for our audience now that we're going to see more and more fires raging through this earth? We had them in New South Wales, in Australia recently. We're having them in Italy. We're having them in Spain, in the US, in California. It's really terrible. So, how do we keep safe and avoid these sort of fires?
That's a big, huge question because we can't control or stop these types of fires because of the climate. I mean, the best thing any of us can do is to understand and start coming to terms with the situation that we're in. And the situation that we're in is one of overshoot. There's too many of us, there's too much consumption. We are robbing energy from the earth to make our lives more comfortable. And that's all exacerbating our situation and our fires and the imbalance that we are having to reckon with. I think the best thing people can do is start to come to grips with reality and really start connecting with our local land. All of the solutions that the crazy people are coming up with, like seeding the clouds and messing with the environment and trying to control climate, are going to end worse than anything. Like maybe we can have a few more years of habitable earth for our industrial civilization. But in the end, we're just compounding the problem. We're making it worse. So is there a way for us to stop fires at this point? I mean, we can't. Everything that we're doing is creating the situation they're in. And the only way that it's going to stop is if we stop taking. If we stop being takers and we learn how to have a reciprocal relationship again with the land and we start giving back. And it's very difficult to think about how we're going to reverse the situation we're in because it took hundreds, thousands, 10,000 years ever since agriculture to get ourselves in this predicament. And now to get out, we're going to have to start releasing on the gas pedal. And I have great faith that the environment could help restoring grassland would be huge. I mean, that could make such a huge difference. Leaving the forests alone. Stop cutting forests. Stop cutting them for all the stupid reasons you're pretending that you need to cut them for. Just stop. Stop destroying. Stop destroying. Stop consuming everything. On the surface, it's simple, but we're so embroiled in this that the only way we're going to stop doing is if it's not available anymore. If the grid went down, if we didn't have access to our technologies, if we didn't have access to the stores, that seems like the only way it's going to stop. But if for those of us who care a lot about it, we've just got to start fighting as hard as we can to stop people from, even if it's like everybody says, NIMBYs, not in my backyard. I'm all for NIMBYs. If you can stop anything, even if it's small, stop it.
What's NIMBYs?
NIMBY, not in my backyard. So a lot of people don't care what's happening on the bigger
Ah,
picture. But if it's their backyard that's about to get destroyed, they're going to start fighting for it. Good. Fight for whatever you can. Stop the destruction of whatever you can, because that's all we got right now. I've done it myself. I've been able to save thousands of prairie dogs with Derek Jensen's help. Derek Jensen has inspired all my work, but with his help, I've been able to stop hundreds of acres of forests from being destroyed because he believed in me and he told me this stuff. And all of us can do that for each other if we believe in each other, because we do have a hell of a lot of power. We just have to take our power back and we have to start prioritizing what's really important. Because is it really important? And I know we're all stuck on it, myself included. Is it really important to get Netflix at night? Is it really important to have our computers every day and to disconnect from each other and not be together? Is it really important to have these things that are so luxurious? It's not. Do I like it? Do I use it every day because it's there? I do. And am I going to stop if it's still there? Probably not. What can we do to get people off their butts and caring enough to fight for their backyards? Come back to the earth, people. Come back to reality. We live here.
yeah.
This is our one and only home.
Yeah, it's true.
And we need to stop fighting for solar panels. That's a dream. That is a lie. That will not get us out of our
Mm.
mess. What will get us out of our mess is getting back to local food systems and to local communities and to connecting with each other in the land again. That's it. We're committing ecocide. This culture is committing ecocide. trying to protect who we can.
Absolutely. Can we use the prairie dogs as an example of how important even little prairie dogs are for the whole ecosystem and as the prairie dogs, all other species, but in particular, now that you're an expert on that, what can you tell us about that?
The story that most inspires me and people seem to really be interested in too is that prairie dogs, like beavers, play a huge role in water retention and in water storage.
What?
Before colonization, they estimate that there were up to 5 billion prairie dogs in the West. And when people would come through and start throwing arsenic, our people would poison the hell out of them in the late 19th century and then of the entire 20th century and still till today. And at first they did it with arsenic and cyanide and would throw grains and then they'd poison all of the prairies and everybody would die. And that was the plan. Everybody wanted everybody to die but cows or livestock and people. So anyway, in doing that process, like a lot of the Native American, the Hopis and the Navajo would say, and probably anybody who would pay attention at first, like, if you kill all the prairie dogs, there'll be no more rain.
Mm,
Like they telling the colonizers, like they're like water people. And
wow.
Bill Mollison, who's a famous permaculturalist, he wanted to look more into that because most of what the indigenous people said were true scientifically when we finally in our infantile brains would figure it out. And so with all of these huge burrow systems, because prairie dogs are burrowers and they create really big burrow systems, and they were all over the plain. They were all over. They would dig these big, huge holes and it would do many, many things. But one of the things that it would do was because of all the aeration and all burrowing animals do this, is it would create these areas for the groundwater to rise and fall with the pulling of the moon, just like
Wow.
tide. And that created condensation in clouds, much like the rainforests do. So there that water up and down and coming closer to the surface and creating condensation would bring in clouds and create rain. And then not only that, all these holes and burrowing systems that aerated the soil also brought minerals. So the plants in prairie dog colonies still today, when you test them compared to plants that don't have prairie dogs on them on the plains, are much higher in minerals because they're able to bring the minerals from down up to the surface so the plants can retain them and
Mm.
they're much healthier and animals get a lot healthier and fatter on these prairie dog colonies. Even though the grasses are shorter, they're getting a lot more nutrients out of the grass because the plants are able to uptake the minerals in the soil. So that's another role. But with the water too, when it rains, then the water goes down these huge burrow systems and recharges aquifers. Aquifers are big, large stores of water underneath the ground. That's where irrigation and the whole piping and everything comes from. They're sucking up all of our underground water supplies. But those water supplies underground were recharged with burrowers, and prairie dogs were the biggest one in the West. We also have voles and all kinds of burrowers, but they all play that same role where water is much more easily trickled down into these holding tanks of water that are underneath the ground. It always really strikes to me so clearly. Like you look at these rodents and people like have lots of things against rodents. It's like whatever, probably because of the rats and the bubonic plague. It really struck fear in everybody about all rodents. But they play this huge ecological role, just like insects or any of us. Our planet is so intricate and connected and so essential for the survival of long-term life of mammals and everybody who's here right now. And people forget that. In a story like that with the prairie dogs, it makes sense when you think about it. But would you have ever thought about it without learning it? Probably not. For us in the West, the only reason we can live in Colorado or anywhere in these Western states is because we have irrigation now. And the only reason native people, humans could live here before we got here was because the beavers and the prairie dogs were here. And they were able to retain water.
So had natural irrigation, basically. It's incredible to think that those little cute animals can do such a huge role in the environment and in the forest and getting everybody fed as well and they can drink. It's incredible. Now I know why you're so passionate about them.
Yep. And eventually we're going to run out of our water for irrigation because we're sucking groundwater dry. Not to say that prairie dogs would be able to allow enough water to trickle down in there for us to use a lot of water. I mean, golf courses alone use as much as all humans combined. That what we use for our personal use. And then industry is way over the top of that. Animal species depend on prairie dogs. A really good example is the black-footed ferret. which is the North America's most critically endangered mammal. They're pretty much functionally extinct now. They're all bred in facilities and then they never survive because the prairie dog colonies aren't big enough. And they're 99% dependent on prairie dogs. And that's why they're going extinct. Burrowing owl is threatened because of the prairie dogs. They depend on prairie dog burrows for their home. That's where they live, in prairie dog burrows. And if they don't have those, or they don't have some type of burrow, they don't survive. And the list goes on and on. I mean, so many different animals. So when their populations are healthy, it's attributed to the role that prairie dogs play in the environment.
Cute and useful.
Yes, very cute. It would be good to get that everybody just understands that we're fucked unless we do something. We could change things too. You know, people have power. I think we forget that. Is it realistic that we'll come up with that and get enough of us together to realize that and start working towards it? I mean, it doesn't seem real realistic, but you never know. It's up to us. If you want to say, are we fucked? It's up to us. It really is.
Thank you so much, Deanna. You've been amazing. Good luck saving those prairie dogs and the forests. And thank you so much again for being on the show.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it.
All right, Climate Warriors, that's a wrap on today's episode. Huge thanks to Deanna Meyer for dropping truth bombs about the state of our forests and reminding us that prairie dogs are basically the eco-superheroes we never knew we needed. Seriously, if you haven't already, go check out her work at prairieprotectioncolorado.org and get involved however you can. And as always, this episode series is brought to you by Against the Tide Films. Want to know more about what we're cooking up? Head over to our website at againstthetidelefilms.com and dive in. Oh, and before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe, rate this episode, and set yourself a little reminder to tune in every Wednesday on your favorite podcast platform for more unfiltered truth about our planet. If you're feeling extra generous and want to support the cause, you can donate on PayPal or snag one of our t-shirts. All proceeds go towards keeping this podcast alive. Links are in the episode description. And finally, thank you for tuning in, Climate Warriors. Until next time, stay informed, stay cute and helpful like those prairie dogs, and keep fighting the good fight. This is Lisa Camillo signing off. Take care and remember, the future is ours to shape.